that hopefully you haven't seen in Photoshop. Now, a lot of people use Photoshop for a lot of different reasons, and we all talk about Photoshop quite a bit. So some of this undoubtedly will be familiar to you, but my goal is to show something new to each and every one of you. Some little piece of what I show today is hopefully something you haven't seen before. I used to really tie Hidden Gems to our most recent release. As you know, we're constantly changing things and releasing things, so that would be even more difficult. I'm really trying to tie it to solving problems. The whole root of Hidden Gems is that we would release the software, and then I would go out and I'd listen to how people were using it, and I'd look at their work, and I'd see areas that people were a little confused about or updates that I wanted to share. And I realized that Hidden Gems doesn't have to be just CS5 or CS6 or CC, but it can really be about a variety of different versions, and it's intended to show you stuff that you don't know about to help you out. So I'm going to show you things that are mainly rooted in CS6 today, but there's a good portion there that's CS5 and even CS4 as well, and that comes from when I'll show something, I'll hear people say, oh, I had no idea that was in there, and I bet that happens a lot. There's a lot of software to try to keep track of. So the other thing that I'll do, since I represent the Photoshop team, is I'll leave a little room at the end for us to have a bit of a conversation. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear your feedback. That's really, really important. More than ever, 23 years on, we really need to listen to our customers, and the most recent versions of Photoshop are very much about listening to you guys. We're not going to focus on future releases. The idea here is to talk about stuff you guys already have in your hands. There are some really exciting sessions on CC and new stuff that's coming. I want to talk about stuff that you have that you might not know about. So that's my name. That's what I do. These are a couple of places that you guys can find resources. Almost all of the Hidden Gems live in little snack-sized videos on the web. I've taken the time to record these. There is going to be a whole new series of them coming to Facebook, a bunch of videos. In fact, we give away a lot of content on there. I'm one of a half dozen people that determines the content that goes on our Facebook page. It's the product team working on that content, so it's really our way of sifting through all the cool stuff that's out there and giving you guys access to it early. So do check that out. One thing that I've never done, I don't think I've done at Max, but I'll do right now. Just I know you've got your little feedback cards and you're writing things down. I want you guys to know that your feedback on this is really important to me. So I see the cards and I see what you thought of things, but this is my Adobe email address. It's not some fake address. I don't imagine we're going to have a lifelong correspondence or anything. But if you do have feedback, or if you can't find what you're looking for afterwards, it's very important to me that you find it. So I want to make sure that you get what you're after. That will actually reach me, and I will give you a response. Okay, so with all of that, let's jump in and step through this stuff. And I'm going to try to leave a little room at the end so that we can answer some questions as well. Okay, so I'm going to drive things out of Bridge. And sort of a hidden gem in and of itself, Bridge was rewritten 64-bit for CS6, which essentially just means it can take advantage of a ton of memory. So I think of Bridge as being somewhat in competition with the Finder, for those of you on the Mac. It's really just about viewing a bunch of different assets. If it's something you've played around with in the past and you walked away for whatever reason, I'll let you know that Bridge came back to where it started, which was in the DI family and the Photoshop family, and it's more stable and more performant than it ever has been before. So give it another try if you haven't in a while. It's pretty cool. I want to talk really briefly about Camera Raw, mainly to dispel the fact that Camera Raw needs to be just for opening RAW files. Camera Raw is a really friendly way to come into Photoshop. It's a really powerful way to interact with Photoshop, but it doesn't have to be just for RAW files. Really, really great tools in there. I'm just going to quickly show you an example. So these are images of the new Porsche 991. I'm a car guy, as shown by Porsche on their website. Perfectly nice images, but I thought it would be interesting to take JPEGs and pass them through Camera Raw just to see what you can do with a file that someone else has already massaged quite a bit. And so what we can do from Bridge, we could hit Command R, and that would pop us into Camera Raw. That's a really quick and easy way to do that. The other way to do it is to come in here to Camera Raw Preferences and say automatically open all supported JPEGs. You can do the same thing with TIFFs. And in a minute we'll talk about some other things you can do with this. So now if I double click on this file, it's just going to launch Camera Raw. Now every once in a while I'll be in here and I'll just be doing a demo and someone will say, how did you get where you are right now? This is really cool, but I've never seen this. And you wouldn't see it unless you had a raw file that prompted it. You need to tell it to open non-raw files. So I'm just going to really quickly show you a couple of the cool things that you can do with Camera Raw that you can't do anywhere else in Photoshop. So for instance, with recovering the highlights, and mind you, again, this is a file that, it's a compressed JPEG from the web, and we're just going to get a lot more dynamic range from it. We're going to introduce a little clarity or mid-tone contrast, a little bit of vibrance, and we're just going to warm it up a little bit. So with just a few clicks there, it's a lot hotter on screen than it is here, but we went from that to that. And so what I'm trying to show you here is that even the JPEGs that are already on the web, even the stuff that's already been compressed, there is so much information sitting there that you can't normally get access to. Camera Raw is a really friendly way to get access to it, and it's a really powerful way. The shadow and highlight recovery in Camera Raw is considerably more powerful than what you find in Photoshop. You have a couple of other things unique in here that you don't find in Photoshop. Temperature, even with the JPEG, you can warm up or cool down a file. And clarity, as I showed before, that could be used for a very crunchy look like that, or even a softer, more ethereal, sort of Vaseline on the lens kind of effect. Of course, the other great thing here is if we get whatever particular look we want, we can go ahead and save that. Let's just call this Max 2013. And when we come back with another image, we could either have synced multiple images, or we can apply that effect quickly and easily to others. So you have a lot of flexibility with it. It's a huge time saver. So for those of you who are playing around with Camera Raw with raw files, just remember it's a great inroad with non-raw files. And for those of you who haven't, it's an app in and of itself. You could spend a lot of time in there, and you could save a lot of time with what you do in there. The other thing I want to show you guys, and this is definitely a bit of a hidden gem. The first update that was done to CS6 was an update to the Camera Raw plugin. And we regularly update that plugin. And normally what we'll do is we'll put in support for new camera models. We also put in new functionality. And one of the things we did with the first update, both to Lightroom 4 and CS6 Camera Raw, is we put in support for 32-bit files. And some of these things are scary to people who don't come from a photographic background. The notion of 32-bit editing or HDR, I think HDR is often synonymous with sort of eye-bleeding, super crunchy, offensive to some, really cool to others, editing. But what I want to show you is that HDR can be really approachable, and it can mean a really nice balanced exposure, in addition to the really surreal, crazy stuff that you see. I think one of the problems with HDR in Photoshop is the dialogue is really intimidating. Got tons of sliders, and it's really not clear what's doing what. So just at its most basic, HDR, or high dynamic range, is combining 3 or more images into one. So what we've got here is a underexposed image, one that's also underexposed but not as much. It's about even. Overexposed, we're starting to see the detail in the shadows, a little more overexposed, and considerably overexposed to the point where there's nothing in the sky. And what we want to do is make sort of an image sandwich of those, bake them all together. So let me show you how this is done, that's a new way of doing this. So I multi-select these, and what I want to do is just control-click or come up to my tools and say, let's go ahead and merge that to HDR Pro. And what it's going to do is it's going to throw them over to Photoshop. It's going to tell me I should be shooting raw, which I should. And it's going to align all of the layers and make sure there's no jitter between them. Then it's going to throw us into this dialog. Now, when you guys see this dialog, you'll probably see the really intimidating 16-bit one. All right, lots of knobs and switches and sliders. This is not the one we want. What we want is to take advantage of all of those images, the full 32-bit file. And so as you can see, this one file has all of the information from all of those images, has the full dynamic range. And all we want to do with this is just say, remove ghosts. And what that's going to do is it's going to look at all of those different images and lock onto the content of one of them. And if we look really closely, down in the lower left-hand corner, it's the one that's outlined in green that is locked onto that content. Now I could override it, and I could say, lock onto the content of any of these other images. It won't change the exposure much. It'll just lock onto the information in there. But I liked that guy in the lower left-hand corner with that New York hat, so I'm going to go with that. What you do is you click OK, and what we have is a 32-bit file. And all you want to do is save that out as a TIFF file. Okay, make sure it's a TIFF. You only have a few files that are supported by 32-bit, and Camera Raw can only read the TIFF. So I think I already have one of these saved. I'll save it just in case. Sample, TIFF. Okay, just OK through those options. And now what we want to do is come back here. Let's see if it dropped it there. All right, here we go. I have a 32-bit TIFF. I think it's the one I saved before. Again, remember, I told Camera Raw to open those TIFFs. You do need to tell it to do that. But what I've got now is all of that power of Camera Raw that I just showed you, the highlight recovery so that I can get the sky back, the shadow recovery so I can get all the stuff in the shadows, and I can combine them to get an image that I never could have gotten before. But I don't have a really scary dialogue. Now this is really sort of overbaked for the sake of you guys seeing what's on screen. You can use this in moderation to have a really pleasant exposure too. I think that HDR used correctly just looks like a nice balanced exposure. But essentially you're getting much more something like what your eye sees. You know, your camera can see highlights or shadows, or it can see a little bit of both. Your eye can see a much wider dynamic range. By taking a few images, and 7 is excessive, you can bake them together and get some really cool results. Not only are these the most powerful editing tools for it, but I think it's a lot friendlier than the tools we've put in HDR Pro. So you guys should check that out. Even if you're not doing HDR now, I think it's a really fun way to interact with the app. Sort of a nod to our designers. We've got some really great designers on the Photoshop team. 2 people support the Photoshop team. And recently in CS6, they ripped apart everything, thousands of icons. They policed all the grammar. They changed the color of the interface. And I think a lot of people might look at that as, well, you just slap some paint on the walls and change the color. Yes, we did change the color. You can change it back. You've got 4 different tones that you can map Photoshop's interface to. But you also have a lot of cool things like these little, I'm just going to transform this so you can see what I'm talking about here. But let's say I draw a rectangle. You'll see that I got a little HUD there that shows me the dimensions of my image. If I were rotating the image, I'd see a HUD for that as well. If I came in here to one of our new blur filters, you'll notice that there's information on screen that shows the strength. If I were to do that in another dialog, you'd see the angle. You'll see little widgets that give you information about your image throughout the application. So really what I want you to know about the interface is, yeah, we made some big obvious changes, but we made hundreds of tiny changes as well. We went out and spent a ton of time with designers, and we listened to their gripes about our interface. The thing we heard a lot, which those of you with a design background can pretty much be probably some of the people we talk to, I'm sure you can appreciate it, is Photoshop, if you're used to make all of these beautiful things, why don't you take a little bit more interest in how you look? Why don't you take a look in the mirror and acknowledge some of the inconsistencies in your own design? So sliders, buttons, all sorts of things. The design team spent a tremendous amount of time going through there and changing things. So this next one's kind of fun. We did more research leading up to CS6 than we ever had any prior version of Photoshop. Like I mentioned, lots of listening to customers and users. And a curious thing happened when we started talking to people about auto functionality. I'd go around and I'd say, are you using any auto tonal controls? Are you using auto levels? Are you using auto curves? And nobody anywhere would cop to it. Nobody would admit that they were. And I thought that was kind of weird. It seemed like I had seen people doing it. I know I had done it myself. And then we looked at the Headlights results. And Headlights is this opt-in program where we can see which features people are using in Photoshop. We don't see their image, but we can tell what they're using in the app. And it showed an enormous number of people were using the auto tonal functionality. It's like, okay, kind of an interesting thing just about human nature, that people don't want to admit they use the automated solutions. And we realized there was a lot of room for improvement there. So the way that auto works now in CS6 is it's truly adaptive. It's truly content aware. What we do is we look at your image, we look at the histogram, and we compare it to a library of thousands of other images like it. We find a histogram that's similar to it, and we adjust a variety of different criteria to give you a better exposure. And it exists in 3 different places. One, brightness contrast used to be kind of Those are bad words in Photoshop, but we overhauled that logic back in CS4, and it works really well now. But just to give you an example, if I click auto, I'm going to get positive 66 brightness, negative 26 contrast. I could open 100 images, and I would get 100 different results for that. It's looking at the histogram, and it's making an auto adjustment. Again, this is kind of a hot screen there. It looks better on my machine. But you get the idea that we've made a dramatic change to that based on the content of the image. So brightness contrast works great. Another area where it's quite different is levels. It's using the same code but with more control. And the way that this one used to work is it used to do things per channel. And you see all of these gaps in the histogram. Two things were happening there. Because we were pretty much just picking a black, gray, and white point, a lot of data was falling on the ground, right? So you were losing a lot of information if you hit this. And the other thing that was happening is you were doing it per channel. So you were introducing a color cast. You're adjusting all of these different color channels, and your image would take on a color cast. So now, by default, the way we do it is we look at your image, your histogram is smooth, you're not losing any information, and it's truly an adaptive result. So I rarely see a lot of nodding heads because people don't want to cop to ever doing this. But if you're not using auto, let me just assume that you guys, none of you are using auto. I really encourage you to try it out because it works really well. And for the power users in the room, I think that the last implementation is probably the most interesting, which is in curves. Now, if you recall, when you used to hit auto in curves, it would just kind of change the image. You wouldn't have any visual feedback other than your preview would look different and probably had a bit of a color cast. Now, if you hit auto, you will actually get a curve generated with editable points. We've got 3 of them in this case. You might have 10 of them. Depends on your image. So it actually gives you a starting point. It actually gives you something to work from. So really powerful stuff. And the first steps towards us really looking at an image and then doing something intelligent with it. I think you'll see a lot more of this from the team in the future. There's a lot of interesting things we could do with the cloud as far as big data, looking at people's images, sharing settings and whatnot. Some really, really fun stuff we could do there. That's the first step. Okay, I know I'm moving quickly. I'm going to tear through this stuff, mainly because I want to hear what you guys have to say. So presets, we're very much living in a world where people love one-touch presets, right? Instagram, all that stuff. You just click one button and dramatically change your image. Photoshop's content hasn't been overhauled in a really long time, so I want to show you 2 places where there's really powerful preset content. And in the first, it's what I consider to be, and this is a pretty overprocessed image, but it'll work just fine for this example. This can be a very intimidating dialogue, right? So we're going to come into our adjustment panel, and there's a new adjustment layer called Color Lookup. And there are engineers on the team that could talk about this for an hour in and of itself. You go very deep on Color Lookup. For the sake of hidden gems and what we're talking about, I want you to just think of this as one-click changes to your image. So what we can do is we can click on this, ignore all the scary terminology, and come in here and just choose any one of these different presets, right? We've got all sorts of cool ones. And the real power here is not just having those, but applying different blend modes and opacities. And I found that using, just a quick before and after, using a color lookup adjustment layer, one of the fixed presets, a blend mode, and a shift in opacity, just a couple of quick clicks, and you can dramatically change your image. What's really cool about this is this can be done on video as well. So one of the things that we put in CS6, one of the things that I was really closely involved with is bringing video to everybody and pretty much making Photoshop do all the things it can do stills to video. So these adjustment layers work just fine there. It's a great way to do color grading and change the look of your image. There is another area. This is a passion of mine, is black and white photography. And I've done a couple books on Lightroom and Photoshop for black and white. And people are always asking, what's the best way to do black and white? Like a lot of things, it depends on what the use is, where it's going, what you're doing with it. But there is a very hidden way to do black and white in CS6. It's very easy if you can get to it. It's got this sort of speakeasy feel to it because you have to do kind of a secret handshake to find it. But let me show you where it is. So you go to your adjustment layers, and you go to gradient map, which some of you may have not been to in a very long time, if at all. And then, after you've done that, you come in here to this little flyout, and I've already selected it, but you come down and you go to photographic toning, and you load the photographic toning presets. They're not loaded by default, but if you load those, what you will get is some really beautiful monochromatic gradient map adjustment layers. You can fade them, you can blend them, you can use masks. They're one click and they will dramatically change your image. They're really, really nice. This is content that we've licensed from an outside party, someone who spent a ton of time building these. There are dozens of them, and they really, really look nice. There's all sorts of different ones. And it's sometimes you just hit the wall and you know that you want an image to look different, but you don't know how. This is a great place to just go in there and start playing around with those. So again, gradient map, come to the little gear that flies out, and come down and load the photographic toning presets. Don't forget you've got my email address if you forget this stuff. It's already, the question was, if you need to load it, where are you loading it from? It's already there. It's in a library where it was installed. We try to limit the stuff we load so we don't completely overload you with a bunch of visual information. In this particular case, I recommend chasing that down and loading it. So it's already on the computer. It's just being presented in Photoshop. But those are really cool. Okay, so just really quickly want to talk about crop. Again, there have been dozens of changes to the crop tool. More than anything, I want to help some people get back to understand some of the changes we made and what they mean. So going back to headlights and research and seeing how people use the application, we found that everybody uses the crop tool. It's not a huge surprise, but when we looked at it, we realized the crop tool really hadn't been changed in Photoshop in almost 23 years. Lightroom, all of these other cool apps had come along, and they were doing really interesting things with the crop tool. And even though it was the most used tool in Photoshop, we hadn't touched it. We really hadn't touched it at all. And as we were doing research, it was amazing how many things we saw in other applications that we could improve our crop tool with, and just how many basic things people do with the crop tool. So the first thing someone does with the crop tool is they draw a rectangle around the whole image. They just select the whole image. So we thought, okay, well, that's pretty obvious. We can just do that right off the get-go. The other big thing that we noticed, so if I select the crop tool, my image is selected. I have a preset here, which is another thing that we added there. I should mention, one of the things people asked for is they said, I want to just hit that front image button. I want the proportions of my image to be loaded as a constraint of the crop tool. So we've up-leveled that in an update to Photoshop. So if I just want my full image, there's that. Now let's say I wanted 5x7. I've got a preset. These are user configurable. I can change them. I can move the image instead of the crop rectangle, change things around here. You'll notice that I've got different overlay. I can change all sorts of different overlays, bless you. But the big thing, and again, a lot of you guys are power users, so this will be sort of a no-brainer to you. But the big thing that we saw happening is people go about their business, and then at some point they come back and they realize they didn't want a cropped version of their image. And they start all over again. We watched this again and again. It was really sad. Someone would spend half an hour on an image, and then you'd challenge them and you'd say, okay, now we need something to fit in this size, or now you need to do this with it. And they'd start all over. They'd go back to their original image and they'd start all over. So by default in Photoshop, we're preserving a non-destructive workflow with the crop tool. We're just promoting a layer-based workflow, and we just do it automatically. Now, if you don't like that and you want to turn that off, you can choose delete cropped pixels and override that. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but if you're looking for an old behavior that isn't there, I just want you to know there is a classic mode that will help you get back to the way things used to be. But I really encourage you, as with any sort of change, take 10, 15 minutes, spend some time with it, get to know your way around, and you'll be just fine with it. There are so many improvements in here. Again, there are dozens of them, and they're pretty well documented on the web as well. But a lot of work went into this, and a lot of information from users like yourselves. So I encourage you to spend some time in the crop tool. And that's one area especially. If there are things that we aren't doing there that you want us to, and I've tracked these pretty closely, send me an email. By all means, reach out and tell me what they are, because I want to make sure that this is working for people as it should. The tough part about changing a tool that everyone uses is everyone notices when there's a change, and different people have different ways of using it. Okay, I know we're racing along here. This next one is a lot of fun. I don't know if you guys have seen adaptive wide angle. Essentially what adaptive wide angle does is it allows you to take an image that was shot with a wide angle lens and tell it which areas in the image should be straight. And the logic is this: if you have a wide angle image and you shot it straight, which is to say that the camera was perpendicular to the wall, then everything's fine. We can apply an automated lens correction. But as soon as you tilt the camera up or down, we're not capturing the orientation of the image. We can't do that yet because the information is not there. So you have to help train the image and say this part should be straight. And that's a really cool demo. If you guys haven't seen it and we have time later, I'll show you. But what a lot of people don't realize is with your old panoramas, like this one from a few years ago, you can use adaptive wide angle on those old panos. We're holding on to that EXIF data there. We know which camera it was shot with. And so what we can do is I can take this pano, which this was shot with a G9, which tells me it's a few years old now. I come into adaptive wide angle. I know that's kind of a scary dialogue, but don't worry about it. Don't even have to change any tools. All we're going to do is just click on this and draw a line. And the line is curved because we know the physical shape of the lens. We know the physical curvature of the lens. I click on that, and it straightens it out. I come over here. I do the same thing. I'm not telling it what the shape is. I'm just saying this is a curved line, it should be straight. Now the key here is to grab the corner of that and rotate that down. Okay? So now I'm going to do the same thing over here. Grab that, rotate it down. And you can, let's do one more, foreground. You can correct these. You can get them looking the way they should have looked. I don't know if you guys have worked with panos like this, but in the past, you just had to deal with all of the issues with the image. You had to deal with all the wonky lens correction. There's been no way to solve this before now, and it really is as simple as just going through your old panos and clicking on them and working through them. So it doesn't apply to just new files. You can take all of your old pre-built panos and fix those up as well. For those of you who want to build panoramas in Photoshop, as of CS4, never easier. You just multi-select them, throw them to Photoshop, and have it auto-align them. It knows the difference between images that should be stacked and distributed in a panorama, and it will do it automatically. We can talk more about that later if we have a second. But adaptive wide angle is a great way to fix those old panos. Okay. Gratuitous picture of my little boy, a couple of years old now. What we're going to do is we're going to blur this. Now, something that's really popular in Photoshop, but I think has been really difficult, is doing a selective blur. Normally you have to build a whole mask and then blur it. Well, a lot of people know that this new feature is in Photoshop. There are a variety of new blurs as of CS6 that are really intuitive. All I do is I increase my blur. I've got my center points where the effect starts, and these outer points, and you can think of the transition between as feathering. A couple hidden gems here, too. One, if I hold the Option key, I can move these independently, right? Which is pretty cool. So people will say, oh, it's not as precise as a selection, but you'd be amazed how far you can get by moving those independently. That's one thing you could do. You can have multiple focus points. So if I want this hand in focus, I can click on that. But the one that I think a lot of people don't know about, which makes this much more powerful than just for blurs, is if I hit the M key, I can see that I've actually built a mask while I was in here. A lot of people don't know this is here. And if I want, I can output that mask as a channel. So don't just think of this as an area to blur your photos, but a quick and easy way to build masks. Really, really cool. Not only can you do a quick blur, but you can build a mask that you can use elsewhere in the application. And that applies to the various different blur filters. I'll talk about this one more in a second, but you can do some really neat stuff. And you've got a lot more controls over here with the bokeh, or how the color and the light blend together. One of the neatest tricks I've seen people do for portraits is they'll take a picture of a cityscape, and then they'll take a headshot. And with the cityscape, they'll blur the whole thing. So they'll take this effect here, and they'll just put this up in the corner, and they will, dramatically blur the whole image and play around with the bokeh, with the light, with the color, and then they'll drop their headshot on top of it. This isn't a great image to show you, but it's a really pleasing effect, and you can do some really neat things with it. But I really like showing people the mask functionality because most people don't know that's there. Iris blur, the question was what was the name of the blur? There are 3 of them, and that's the iris blur. Just think of it as a much faster, easier way to do a lens blur. Yeah?
Quickly show again the uncrop feature, the reveal all, because I think some people in the audience is a quick, just where they need to.
Sure. If we have a second at the end, I'll be happy to show it again. In the interest of time, I have so much stuff I want to show. I'm going to race ahead, but we can absolutely revisit it. One of the things that happened in CS5, we were moving to 64-bit on the Mac. And unlike Windows, which it wasn't a light switch, but it was pretty easy to bring 64-bit to Windows, for the Mac, we had to do a pretty monstrous rewrite. We rewrote millions of lines of code, just a ton of code. And in order to get out the door, we had to drop a couple of features that didn't make it to 64-bit. One of them was lighting effects. And if there was ever a feature where I thought people wouldn't really notice that it wasn't there, it was lighting effects. There have been a few of these over the years where it's like, who's going to know? It's just not going to be there, and no one's even going to know. Wow. A lot of noise about lighting effects. If you want to know how much someone uses something, take it out of there and just wait for the phone to ring. wait for the email to pour in. Pretty crazy how many people enjoy lighting effects and use lighting effects. So we rewrote lighting effects. It uses the 3D engine. It's very fast, very powerful. More than anything, I just want to let you guys know it's back. It's here under render. It's been completely rewritten, and it works really, really well. It's a very similar visual feedback as what we saw in the blur control, which is to say that there's a little slider right on the image, and you've got you can move that around. You can have multiple lighting effects. You can have different sorts of presets. You can have different light sources, spot, infinite. You have tremendous control here. Here's where you're starting to see that this is leveraging our 3D engine for this. Really cool. Vincent Versace and a number of other photographers have written chapters, even books, on how to use this new stuff. There's a lot there. You could spend a lot of time in there. So for those of you who missed lighting effects, it's back. For those of you who haven't played around with this, it can do more than it ever has. So I've seen some really neat stuff from there. Okay. I'm going to just put this on screen. I know we're recording this, so I'll leave it on screen for a second. I don't want you guys to feel like you have to write all of this down because this information is out on the web. If you were to just put CS6 JDI out on the web, you would find this. But as we're looking at this, let's see if I can zoom in a little. The JDI program is something that we actually took a page out of the video team's playbook. And what they used to do, they still do, is in the midst of their development, they'd say, hey, let's stop and work on just user-focused stuff. Let's listen to some gripes that the community has, and let's implement those features. And the rules are they have to be coded, implemented, and tested in less than a week. And so for CS5, I drove this project called JDI for the Photoshop team, and I said, hey, let's try to do as many as we can in a week. And I thought maybe we'd get 10 of these done. That would be great if we got 10 user-facing changes to the application done. And when they were done, we had 3 dozen. And these ended up being things that literally, I'd come off stage sometimes, and some of the things we put in there, people would come up to me and hug me. They would physically wrap their arms around me and thank me for these things because they were spending all day in Photoshop, and some of these things would save them, an hour a day or a few hours a week or a day a month or something. They were really making their lives easier. So of course we did it again for CS6. Really the news that I want to share with you, again, you can get to this list just by Googling CS6 JDI Photoshop, is that we did over 5 dozen of them. This is really important to us. It's been a great program. I'd love to hear your ideas for them. Feel free to email me, again, bhughes@adobe.com. But we've got grammar, file formats, brushes, tons of changes to layers, tons of changes to liquify, the presets I mentioned before. The rules are it needs to be done in a week, and it's amazing how much this team can do in a week. And the more positive reinforcement they get from our user community, the more they want to do this stuff. So it's been a really great program, and I want you to know that I talk about a lot of big splashy features, but some of this little stuff, especially for you power users, this is the stuff that really makes a difference. So we really do care about that sort of thing a lot. All right. Back to this picture of Miles, I'll just use it as an example really quickly. In CS5, we had a plugin that was available through Labs. If you guys haven't played around on Adobe Labs, which is labs.adobe.com, although I think Adobe Labs redirects there intuitively, there are a variety of free updates and technologies. That's where our Lightroom 5 public beta is right now. There was an oil paint filter. There are actually all sorts of pixel bender filters, which were hardware accelerated. And the one that everybody loved was oil paint. And so people would ask all the time, why isn't oil paint in Photoshop? And it wasn't ready for prime time by any stretch of the imagination. It hadn't been tested. And testing something to come into Photoshop, you have to run it through all this grueling abuse, different bit depths and file formats and color modes and resolutions, and stuff goes through a real workout before it ends up in Photoshop, because Photoshop reaches a lot of people. But we heard overwhelmingly that once people found the oil paint filter, they really loved it and they really wanted it in there. So it's a feature in CS6. It can be found top level under the filter menu. And the whole reason I got involved in photography to begin with is because I couldn't draw or paint. Not that this is a replacement for that, but you can get a pretty interesting result really quickly by playing around in here. So let's just look at how this works. We've got a few different sliders here. And it's all GPU accelerated. It's all taking advantage of my GPU, so it's really, really, really fast. And like any, you can use this as a filter layer. You could blend it. You can do all sorts of really neat stuff with this. It works really quickly. You can mask things, of course. But you can get some really cool results. And I know a lot of people were using it when it was a Labs filter, but I want to let you know it's in the app and it works better than it ever has been. Very stable. That was one of the problems with it before. Something I spent a little more time on, again, not an artist, not a painter, but just playing around with one of those 991 JPEGs off of Porsche's site, over-processing it and then passing it through there. You can do some cool stuff with it. It's really neat. Okay, so we start to transition. I'm going to talk about a couple things that have happened very recently, and then I'm going to talk about some older hidden gems that people might not know about. One of the things I'm really proud of is how we responded to these machines, these Retina MacBook Pros. I was part of the group that was working with Apple under NDA. For anybody who thinks Adobe doesn't have a really strong, great relationship with Apple, I can tell you we were literally involved with each other from the first days. We invested in each other, and when we heard that there were new machines coming out that were going to literally have the highest resolution screen of any computer out there, we worked extremely closely with them to make sure that we had something to show at WWDC. So we had pre-release builds. We were working on it right away. And as I mentioned, we had just ripped apart our UI, and we had to rip it apart all over again. Thousands of icons had to be redesigned to run on the Retinas. And it was tossed around, how should we make this available? What should we do as far as the update goes? I was really proud of Adobe for releasing this as a free update to everyone who bought Photoshop CS6. It would have been really easy to sit on it and hold out and wait for the next version just because of the way that we release software and the way we do our marketing and messaging. But we just let the free update go, and that was for Illustrator and Photoshop. So for those of you running on a Retina MacBook Pro, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Photoshop just worked and looked better than it ever had overnight. Because without native support, we're stretching pixels. We're pixel doubling here, and it really doesn't look good. And that's not acceptable for the kind of work that we're all doing. So that was one of the first updates we did to the app. For subscribers, which for those of you who were at Max in 2011, I think you got Creative Cloud memberships. I know a lot of you have them. I guess all of you have them now. We're able to give you updates that we are unable to give perpetual customers. With the perpetual software, we tell Wall Street, we tell the world, this is what we're selling. And it remains that until we're done selling that. With the subscription, with the update, we can change it anytime. Anytime we have technology that's ready to go, we can just flip the switch and release it to you guys. And so there are a couple things I want to show you guys that came out in a 6.1 update to Photoshop that this is just showing you just a start of what we've been up to here. And this was a couple months ago now. So one of them, power users, let's say that I came in here and I started recording an action. We haven't made changes to actions. I've been on the Photoshop team for 15 years. I don't think we've made changes to actions in that time. If we have, they were minor. and they skidded right by. But one of the things we have in here now, which is really cool, is conditional actions. So for those of you who are automating Photoshop, which any of you in a production environment probably are, you can come in here and you have these if-then statements for actions. So, if my document's square, if it's CMYK, if it's a pixel layer, if it's this or that, then play such and such action, one that you've recorded, or else play this one. People have been asking for this for a really long time. Granted, this is a very specific group of Photoshop users that are leveraging automation, but the sort of person who's using this is spending a lot of time in Photoshop, and it allows you to do things with actions that you've never been able to do before. So another update is around blur for video. So I mentioned before, I think I could talk about video for a long time. It's something I think is really cool because there's so much video being generated these days. There's more video being generated now than there ever has been, just like there are more pictures being generated and shared than ever before. Unlike photos, most video is not being edited at all. And so the idea wasn't to compete with an NLE or Premiere or any of those amazing video products, but to say, hey, if you're just getting your feet wet with video and you know how to use Photoshop, you can do it with video. We've got essentially, think of it as iMovie functionality in Photoshop, but all of your adjustment layers and all of your filters work on your video clips. So I've got an amazing piece of video footage that I've created myself here. I thought that if I took my 5D Mark II and I bought a Zeiss lens, that the rest would just happen naturally. It's not the case. Video is a whole different thing, but it's a lot of fun to play around with. Anyway, I can do any of my adjustment layers. I could do that color lookup that I showed you earlier, gradient map. I could do any of that to video. But one of the things I can do with the update is I can apply a blur to video, and that wasn't initially available. And all you have to do with any of those is to convert this to a smart filter. Essentially what that's doing is it's just putting a wrapper around it, saying whatever you do to one part, do to the whole thing. And so now, if I come in here, I can come into iris blur, and we'll just pull that down. We'll excessively blur that, pull this in, and click OK. And this will be a little slow here because I'm asking it to do a lot, but you will see that indeed we've applied a blur to video. So just really neat stuff that you can do with your video files in Photoshop. All of your filters, all of your adjustment layers. It's pretty powerful. All right, how are we doing on time? The other thing I wanted to show you is that Liquify, a lot of people don't know that Liquify is dramatically overhauled for Photoshop. This is one of those things where I thought, Liquify, we knew there's a lot of cool stuff that we could do. One of our engineers showed it running what he referred to as 100 times faster. I think of it as just runs in real time. And we thought, well, that's a feature that's been in since Photoshop 6. Is Liquify something that people are really using? We went out and we talked to photographers and retouchers. It's amazing how many people use Liquify. And they don't use it for the crazy things that are undoubtedly running through your mind. They use it for moving water and fabric and trees and these little subtle shifts. So we made a lot of changes to Liquify. You can come in here and you can, the limitation for Liquify's brush used to be 1,500 pixels. It now goes up to 15,000 pixels. It works in true real time. Anything that you do in here, you're never going to get ahead of this. Beautiful artwork of mine. It used to be that you would be held hostage by it. It would be trying to catch up. You've got an advanced mode and a simple mode, as you see here. But what's cool about this is now, as of this update, you can go back and you can change your liquefaction after the fact. So think of smart objects, smart filters are essentially filter layers. People noticed that Liquify didn't conform to that. Now it does as of the update. So there's a lot that's changed about Liquify, and as of the .1 update, we just added one more thing, which is smart object support. So I'm keeping right to my time. Let's spend about 10 minutes looking at some older stuff that a lot of people don't know about, some things that I think are really cool, and we'll leave 5 minutes for questions, okay? All right, so a quick one. This is an oldie. picture of Miles when he's tiny, shot with the iPhone 3G, 1 megapixel image, and super furry cat. And what I want to show you guys here, people ask me all the time, what's the best way to do selections and masking in Photoshop? I'll show you my favorite way. I don't think there is any one best way to do anything in Photoshop. There's lots of different ways. I like to use the Quick Select tool, and this is something that a lot of people don't know about. Quick Select, the way that it works is you paint the areas that you want selected. Okay, I'm just dragging along here. And at some point, I'm sure this has happened to you guys, it all goes wrong and it just selects everything. And you say, I'm never using that again. Yes, it was quick, but it did a terrible job. Don't give up. What you want to do is hit the Option or Alt key, and now you want to tell it the area that you don't want. Okay, this is key, really powerful. This is learning about your selection. The more you tell it, the more it knows. And I don't think we've made that clear. So I'm telling it I don't want those areas, and just to clear up, I do want those. Okay, so now we've got a pretty good selection here. Might not be perfect, but it's pretty good. All right, so now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to come into Refine Edge, which, again, really, really great place to perfect your selection. I'm going to come in here and change this to black and white. Okay. I'm going to hit Smart Radius, and I'm going to increase my radius. And you'll see that I'm picking up individual strands of hair. Now, I think this is pretty remarkable. I'm picking up individual strands of hair on a 1 megapixel image of a cat. I mean, a very furry cat at that. And the way that we go from here is we use that same approach that we're using with Quick Select, which is I'm just going to use the Option key to drag over these areas that I don't want. And just like that, it's learning about my image. The more I tell it about the edges, the more it knows about the whole selection. And so you remember over here where there was a whisker? If I just say somewhere around here's a whisker, that pops back in there. So this is really, really cool, really powerful, tough to select hair. This is the toughest thing I could think of to do a selection of, especially a low-res image. So for the most part, everything I show you guys, these are my own files. I try to break this stuff. I'm not going to stand behind something I haven't used myself. This really does work. So take the time to try those steps out, and I think you'll really enjoy that. Okay, so that's a good one. That was from like CS4. Here's another one, which I thought, I was beginning to think no one cared about this one. And I think it's super cool, but no one ever asked about it. I never saw it in play. I never saw people doing anything with this. And then this last year I went out to New York for Photo Plus, and I had three people in 2 days come up to me and ask about focus blending. It was so weird. I mean, this was like 5 years ago we put this feature in Photoshop, and no one's ever asked about it. I never saw anybody write about it. It just sort of snuck by people, and all of a sudden all these people are asking me about it, and in different venues, so it's not like they were talking to each other. And the idea is, if we have these images, again, my images, my dad's backyard, I don't know why he has these, and what I've done is I've handheld these shots, and I've focused on different ducks, right? What I'm trying to show is that I can combine all of these and focus on everything. Now, there are a few times when you'd want to do this. If you didn't have a lot of light and you wanted to get more depth of field, if you wanted to do something that was photographically impossible, like focus on one thing and another, but not the areas in between. If you were shooting macro photography, right? I've shot a lot of jewelry. Jewelry's tough because if you're shooting really close, you're only going to get a tiny piece of it in focus, even if you have an amazing macro lens. But if you were to shoot 5 images and focus bracket, you can bake them together. Well, let me show you how it works. We take these images, we multi-select them, come into Tools, Photoshop, and we say load files into Photoshop layers. Okay? And it's going to farm those over to Photoshop, and it's going to make each one its own individual layer, as we'll see over here. Now, just so you know, kind of a hidden gem slash grammar bug or consistency bug, if you were to come in here to scripts, you can do this from here as well, but we use a different term. We say load files into stack. Same exact thing. Really there just to show you that the Bridge team and the Photoshop team are not the same people. It's the only reason that's there. We're going to multi-select these, shift-click, and we're going to do two things. One, edit auto-align layers, and just trust in auto, click auto, and this is going to show you just how handheld those images are. We're not going to worry about that. And then auto-blend. And as I mentioned before, Photoshop knows the difference between a panorama or a stack of images. And I'm just going to say, okay, stack of images, do what you will with that. Good luck. And it's going to look at each and every image, and it's going to look at the focus, and it's going to blend all of these images together for me. And that's pretty crazy to me, that it's brought all of those into focus. And if you look over on the right, it's built a very detailed mask for all of those. And our next step here would be to just crop in on this a little bit. I was amazed at even what it did with the water. Did a really, really nice job with that. So we cropped that, and we've got editable masks from all of that. It was handheld, it was me just fooling around, and it did a really great job. So I realized that's a really specific sort of out there use of Photoshop, but a lot of people don't know that's there, and there's some really cool stuff that could be done with it. You know, you could have a wedding party standing in a line, and you could highlight individual people in focus and then have it sort of fade out of focus in between. You could do these things that are photographically impossible and really visually interesting. So apparently there's a growing interest. I'll count on you guys to help spread the word. I want to show you something you may have seen because it was a really cool feature, although a lot of people don't know about it, and then an alternate use for it, and that's content-aware scale. Just quick show of hands. How many people have heard of content-aware scale? Okay, about a quarter of you. The idea here, this was the first content-aware tool we put in Photoshop, and the idea is if I have an image and I want to resize it, maybe I don't want to crop it. Maybe I don't want to lose the images on the edge. So, for instance, full frame off of a camera, off most cameras, would be like 4 by 6. If you multiply that by 2, it's 8 by 12, not 8 by 10, like the common frame size. Well, if you cut off 2 inches, we'd lose the people on the side here. So what if we could reshuffle the contents of the image without losing valuable information? So that's what content-aware scale does. And the way that it works is I just select this image, and I come up here to Edit, Content-aware scale. And if I pull this in, it's going to start discarding water and rocks and sand, and it's going to hold on to the people in the image. And it's just going to rejigger them. What's really neat about this is if I make it bigger, these are my original proportions, we'll actually start to add water, sand, rocks. And you'll see that these will become longboards, right? Not perfect, but let me show you how to fix that, because this is cool. All right, so let's exit out of there, and here's the hidden trick. Take Quick Select, or the selection tool of your choice. Select someone. Okay, that's perfectly fine. I like to expand it just a little bit, just to be safe, and then we're going to save that. Call this Max 2013, no smoke and mirrors. And again, take this, select the whole thing, and come into content-aware scale, give them longboards again. But if I come up here and I say protect Max 2013, you'll see that he'll go back to the proportions he's supposed to be. So you can multi-select things, you can protect things. This is a really, really neat tool. You can use this for all sorts of different things. Obviously, changing images. Maybe you want to take an image and you want to make a banner on a web page. You want to change the proportions of it, but you want the content to remain static. Really great use for that. You want to reframe an image. You want to make something vertical that used to be horizontal. You have a lot of control with this. I mean, you can really start to mess with the information that's there. You can even do cool things like select the inverse and then make it smaller, and things will start disappearing from the image. That was sort of content-aware fill before content-aware fill. And the hidden use case with this that I like is you can use this on screenshots. So when I showed this to Lori Grunin at CNET years ago, she thought it was a really neat feature, but then I showed it to her using it for a screenshot, and she got all excited about it, much more excited than she did about a photo. So imagine I select this whole thing, and I want to use this on a blog, or I want to use this, maybe I want to do a screenshot for a different orientation monitor, or something like that. I come into content-aware scale, and what it's going to do is it's just going to discard the dead information. It's just discarding dead pixels. So it's a really great way to resize a screen capture. Really, really effective for that. A lot of the time when people are blogging or doing some sort of web content, they'll need to rejigger an image, and they'll end up just cropping it. They'll end up just killing the image. So that's a fun way to do that. Got 5 minutes. Let me see if I can show you. All right. one last thing. I like this one a lot. I'm going to combine two demos in one here. Okay, so I want to show you a way to quickly and easily remove a power line from an image that a lot of people don't know. But it's kind of complicated, so I also want to show you another thing, which is called Tutorial Builder and Tutorial Player. These are on Adobe Labs, and essentially, just bare bones way that they work, as you're using Photoshop, they write a tutorial. Okay, now I showed this at Max 2011, and it blew people away that we're just building a tutorial on the side in the background. Well, then the folks who did this came out with what's called Tutorial Player. It's hooked up to the iPad, and you can put the tutorials on there. But it gets better. Not only are we writing out tutorials as you do something, those tutorials can drive Photoshop as well. So I want to make you aware of this more than anything. It's a free technology. You can pull it down from the iTunes store. Let me show you how it works. Come over here, and essentially here it is on Adobe Labs. Automatically create interactive step-by-step Photoshop tutorials. That's where you get this thing. If you want to go to the iTunes store, Tutorial Player, all these cool tutorials that drive Photoshop. That's where you get the other part of it. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this image. I already have Tutorial Builder in here, and it just looks like this. Start. Do you want this to be your before image? Yes. Okay. Zoom in a bit more here, and I'm going to come over here to my Path tool, and I'm just going to click on the image here, drop a point right there. The best way to get rid of these power lines is to take my spot healing brush, make sure it's on content aware, not proximity match. Take a small brush and come over here to my path panel and stroke that with the brush. Automatically removes the line, does a great job. If you've ever tried to do that manually, almost impossible. Really, really nice. Okay? I'm done. Do you want to save this tutorial? Yes. Do you want to save as an after image? Yes. Process that. Okay. And then I'm just going to come back here to these results, puts it in a folder. All the HTML is there. It's all editable. But what we've done is we've written a tutorial on this. We've got a before image, an after image, the steps, the tools, and if I had this on the tablet, it would actually drive Photoshop as well. So many cool things happening here. I'm building a tutorial just by using Photoshop. That tutorial can drive Photoshop. That tutorial can also live on a tablet that, using our Touch SDK and Wireless SDK, can drive Photoshop from the tablet. So that's really, I think that's the future of ebooks, especially with something like Photoshop, is you don't just have an electronic book. You have an electronic book that has a connection to what you're trying to learn about, and you can drive it. You can even use your own images in the tutorial. You can choose to have a different image. It'll load that image into Photoshop, and it'll allow you to process it. I went to 158. Maybe we'll take it to 202. Before I take questions, I just want to thank you guys very much for your time and for listening. I hope that you learned some stuff from this. Really appreciate all of you turning out. Let's take a couple questions, and I'll be dutiful about repeating them. Any questions? I was going to say, you guys are going really easy on me. Right. So the question is there a PDF where I can get all of this? Photoshop.com/people/Brian, that link I showed at the beginning. Feel free to, if you go to YouTube, there's a bunch of hidden gems. And as I mentioned on Facebook, a few weeks from now, I'll be putting a bunch more videos up there. So I just did a photo restoration workshop that we put up there. We did that free through lynda.com, and I'm working on some new hidden gems content as well. So this is part of the reason that I don't package this up in a book or something, is it's always changing. It changes like every week, so I'm always adding to it. There are dozens of different videos on this content out on the web. So, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, you showed blur on video. If someone was moving through a video, could you have them follow that? There's a pretty arduous way to do that with Photoshop, where you insert frames as layers, but you would have to methodically track through layer by layer. As you're importing video, you can actually have it, you can say, bring in every single frame as a layer, bring in every 10 frames as a layer, And if you wanted to take the time to go through and do that and move it, you could do it that way. But that's a pretty time-consuming process. Yeah, could be done, but not really built for that particular use case. Yeah. Yeah, so we can bring in, AVI and .mov files and whatnot. Once it's in Photoshop and you're taking advantage of Photoshop's functionality, it's just a really intelligent PSD that does all this other stuff. You can, yeah, so if you have a video file and you want to export that, you just go to Render Video, and there's tons of different presets. And they're all configured for different screen sizes and different formats and all of that. Okay, so I want to be really kind to the next speaker and get out of his way, but thank you guys again. I'll hang out afterwards.